Picture with me, if you will, our gospel story today. Jesus is teaching, and the scribes and the Pharisees come to him, interrupt him, or maybe they raise their hand, or I'm not sure. We can picture it anyway. But they say to Jesus, "By what authority do you do these things?" And he says to them, "I will ask you a question, and if you answer it, then I will also answer your question." Let's push pause right here. Freeze frame the image that you have conjured in your mind, because I want to tell you a little aside. Did you know that in the Gospels, Jesus never declares himself the Messiah or the Christ? Never once does he refer to himself as the Messiah or the Christ. He refers to himself as the Son of God, which is not really that radical because that is a term used for kings and rulers. There was always a ceremony when someone was put on a throne that indicated their divine blessing, the divine blessing upon them, and thus made them a son of God. We have continued this forever. We have coronation ceremonies, which then invoke God's blessing upon the ruler, the king, the queen. This has been happening forever, and Jesus, when he refers to himself as the Son of God, is leaning into that reference. Sometimes he refers to himself as the Son of Man, indicating his humanity. And so, again, no big deal. People have heard this before. Jesus never refers to himself as the Christ or the Messiah. Now, there is, as you remember earlier in Matthew's Gospel, a discovery of who Jesus is when he says to his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And then he says to them, "Who do you say that I am?" And it's Peter who says, "You are the Messiah, the one who has come into the world." This is in the 16th chapter of Matthew. And remember how delighted Jesus is by Peter's proclamation. And he says to him, "Peter, flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father in heaven has revealed this to you." And then he tells them not to tell anyone that he is the Messiah. You see, Jesus never seeks to convince anyone of who he is. He knows that that is impossible. And when you see his resistance to attempting to convince anyone of who he is, you start to see it everywhere through the scriptures. I'm going to take us on a brief little hop through the Gospels. John chapter 9, when this man is born blind and he's brought before the religious leaders and they ask Jesus, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And there's this takes up the whole chapter, this big dialogue about why is he blind and was he really blind? Because Jesus actually then puts mud on his eyes and he can see. And this then opens up a whole nother conversation about who Jesus is and how sin and health are in relationship and how all of this works. And at the very end of the chapter, the 9th chapter in John's Gospel, Jesus finds this man that he has healed who has just left the scene because he's fed up with the interrogation. Jesus finds him and says, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" And the man who was born blind says, "Tell me who he is and I will." And Jesus says, "You are looking at him." Jesus never declares himself as the Messiah or the Christ. Go also to Mark 9. That 9th chapter has another very powerful story where a man has a son who is prone to seizures, and it convulses his body so violently that it has tossed him into the water or into the fire because it's come on like that, right when they were busy doing household life. And it has threatened his life on several occasions, these seizures that he has. And people don't understand how this stuff works in that time. And so it's often believed that illness is related to some type of sin or evil. And so again, here is this man with this son, and he's desperate for his healing because the seizures have threatened his life on so many occasions. The disciples say to Jesus, "Oh, we couldn't fix this." And this man comes to Jesus and he says, "Lord, can you help me? I mean, I don't know if anything's possible." But Jesus says, "Possible? All things are possible for the one who believes." And he says to the man, "Do you believe?" And the man says, "I believe. Help my unbelief." And Jesus looks upon him, grants him the faith that is within him, and heals his son. Jesus does not proclaim himself as the Messiah, the Christ. He lives it out in his life. Again, in Matthew 15, a few chapters from where we are today, we have the Canaanite woman who goes to Jesus and says to him, please heal my daughter. And he looks upon her and he says, I didn't come for you. I came for the lost sheep of Israel. And she, in essence, says, I don't even have a right to ask you for healing. I'm not one of your children. I might be likened to a dog that's around the periphery of the table. But please, can I have a crumb? She believes in him, and he recognizes her faith, and her daughter is healed. Jesus never seeks to convince anyone that he is the Messiah or the Christ. We hear this also in John chapter 14, when Jesus is with his disciples at the Last Supper, and Philip says to him, Jesus, show us the Father and we will believe. And I imagine in that scene that Jesus is like, oh my gosh, have I been with you all this time and you still don't believe? I've been with you for 3 years. We've been living together and you still don't believe? He says to Philip, if you don't believe me, at least believe the works themselves. We are not ever, God never seeks to convince us to believe. He puts us out there. He puts himself out there again and again and again and again and says, do you want to believe? You're invited to believe. Do you want to believe? You're invited to believe. But Jesus and God the Father also never seeks to convince people, I am. I think of this also you see this in the 22nd chapter of Luke. I haven't referred to that gospel yet in this little skip through the 4 of them. But hear this passage right at the end of Luke's gospel, when Jesus goes before the council. This is after he has been arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he's brought before the religious leaders. And it says this in the 22nd chapter of Luke's gospel. When the day came, the assembly of the elders of the people, both chief priests and scribes, gathered together, and they brought Jesus to their council. They said, if you are the Messiah, tell us. Jesus replies, if I tell you, you will not believe. And if I ask, and if I question you, you will not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the power of God. All of them asked him, are you then the Son of God? And Jesus says to them, you say that I am. Then they say, what further testimony do we need? We have heard it ourselves from his own lips. Really? Jesus never said he was the Messiah. He said, you say things about me. And after this, the religious leaders take him before Pilate, who oversees this region. And they rose as a body and brought Jesus before Pilate. They began to accuse him, saying, we found this man perverting our nation, forbidding us to pay taxes to the emperor, and saying that he himself is the Messiah, a king. And then Pilate asked Jesus, are you the king of the Jews? And Jesus answers, you say so. Then Pilate says to the chief priests and the crowds, I find no basis for an accusation against this man. But they were insistent and said, he stirs up the people by teaching throughout all Judea, from Galilee where he began, even to this place. Do you hear, my friends? Do you hear how it is that Jesus operates in the world? That he does not seek to convince anybody of anything. He seeks to just live his life and say, you are invited to believe. Here it is. Judge yourself. And I believe that this is because of the truth that no one can convince anyone of anything that they don't want to believe. We even have trouble convincing someone of something that they actually want to believe. It made me think that a lawyer doesn't convince the jury that his client is innocent. He only has the jury discover their own insecurity or doubt that he is guilty. We don't convince one another of anything. Jesus doesn't seek to convince us that he is the Messiah. Neither did God seek to convince the Hebrew people that he was God. We think about those things that seek to convince, and they intimidate us and scare us, to be sure. And we, this week as a nation, remembered Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the first woman to ever lie in state. Quite a remarkable acknowledgement of her contributions to our common life. And one of the things that was so profound in her was her ability to look at these structures and systems that we all operated in and see if they not only bound the one who felt bound, but if they bound the one who was doing the binding. One of her favorite cases was, I'm going to look up their names in my little notorious RBG book here. One of her favorite cases to refer to was one that she argued, Weinberger versus Weisenfeld, on behalf of a widowed father who was incapable of collecting Social Security after his wife died in childbirth for their only son. How is it, RBG brought to everyone's attention, that the laws of the land don't protect all people? And she held before all of us that example of someone who could not have the provision necessary to care for his only child. She helped us see that we can often be locked in a codependent relationship that actually stifles our lives. We need someone to help us look at things, those systems and structures that are in place, and help us question, is this really good for everybody? It seems good for the people in power, but it actually might not be as good as it might seem. Such was this case that RBG argued early in her career, but then she also demonstrated that time and again in her life. So it makes me wonder, is it considered liberal to want to dialogue and debate some of the structures within which we all operate? If we think perhaps there's a better way, then wouldn't it be worthwhile for us to engage in a conversation? Maybe we'll discover that there's a way that's more liberating for all of us, a new way that frees all of us. We realize that sometimes we are confined by things, and if we can't imagine how it is that we're confined, then we can't imagine another way. Those that aren't confined can't imagine that there's any confinement happening out there. I don't feel it. The privilege of freedom in the system keeps anyone from recognizing the voices of those that don't have that same freedom. But we must remember we can't convince anyone of anything. If Jesus didn't do it, why would we think we could? God doesn't convince us of anything either. And when we look at the Old Testament passage for today, we see that God wants to reveal God's self in the life of his people, this people that he has called to himself. But they have to want to see that God is with them. Our Old Testament lesson this morning starts at chapter 17, but it picks up from chapter 16, which we read last week, where the Hebrew people are in the wilderness. Last week they were complaining because they had no food. And they said, why didn't we just die by the flesh pots in Egypt? We were slaves, but at least we were sitting by the flesh pots. And I can't help but blame them. I like a little fat on my meat too. But here they were out there complaining against Moses, complaining, and Moses was sick of their complaining, and he says, don't pick on me, you need to take this up with God. I just led you out here, but you're God's people. And so God says, I'm going to feed them manna. And we didn't read the whole passage, we didn't read the whole 16th chapter last week. I hope you will, because God says to them, look, I'm going to give you enough for every single day. You need to collect that, and you will have your fill. And people got a little greedy, and they took a little bit more than what they were supposed to take. But you know what? It actually came out to just the right amount. Nobody ever had excess, and nobody ever had want. And then God said, look, I'm going to give you twice as much as you need. Actually before that, when they did keep some excess, some of them held it back overnight so they would have some for the next day. And the morning, it was filled with worms and it was foul. So God said, I told you, I'm going to give you every day what you need. Take what you need, and you will have exactly what you need, and the next day I'll do it again. And they were like, okay, except that then it came to the anticipation of the Sabbath, and Moses said, listen, God said, you can take 2 days worth today because tomorrow's the Sabbath and it's a day of rest. So they did. They took 2 days worth. And some of them on the day of rest said, you know what, I'm going to go out and look. Maybe there's some more somewhere else. And they went out and God said, I told you, I will give you what you need. You have what you need. Take what is rightfully yours. I've given you instructions. So the people are getting the hang of this, but they don't really like it, and they're still complaining. And so here we come to chapter 17 of Exodus, where they say to Moses, oh, we don't have any water. What'd you do, bring us out here to die? And Moses is like, oh, you are driving me insane. Read it for yourself. He goes on and on. Don't complain against me. Complain to God. It's God. You're God's people, not me. And he complains to God. And God says, look, I am going to provide for them. I already have. I still am. Go out there and touch the rock, and the water will come forth from the rock. And so it happens. We can often complain against God for how things are. And God says, look, I told you a long time ago I'm going to provide for you. I don't know why you're freaking out on me. Do you not notice that I've given you everything you need? but we do freak out. Somebody said to me once, they said, Whitney, I don't know how you lead St. Stephen's. I think it's a really hard congregation to lead. And I said, oh, well, yeah, sometimes it is, that's for sure. But you know what, Moses, he had an ardor. Complaining is one thing that we people do all the time. It's what we do, and especially with God, when God's having God's way, and we say, oh, I like it. I like to be in charge. I want to be the one to construct the ways of the world. But we realize that we can't legislate the righteousness of God. And this is the problem that Jesus has with the scribes and the Pharisees in our gospel lesson today. You see, when we legislate, we inevitably get it wrong. I ask you, as you look over this past week, how did we set up a system that allows the results of Breonna Taylor's story to be? Something went wrong there. Something's wrong in this picture, and we constructed it. How did we do or not do things that resulted in more than 200,000 deaths from the coronavirus? Are we going to mandate masks? Oh, are you kidding me? That's not going to work. Are we going to insist that people return to school and work so the economy can get going again? That's not going to work. We create these systems of righteousness, so we desire, but they all fall short. None of them fully complete the picture that we need. And we wonder, as we've endured these 6 months, which I have to say have really been hellish. This has been a hellish year. We look at it and we say, how do we create societal structures that have so many inequalities, whether it be education or employment or healthcare, whether the afflictions of the body or the provisions for the body? Golly, things are really messed up. We made systems that tie education to where you live, and we say, oh, well, let the ignorant stay in their zip code. That doesn't happen. We look at these issues of health care and we say, how is it that we can address these? This is Suicide Prevention Month, my friends. And one of the most successful ways of suicide is by firearms. But we've set up a system that doesn't allow us to dialogue about guns in our world. It was an accident, I think, but it was born out of a desire to legislate a reality that we find really it's filled with shortcomings. You can learn about this. I'm not going to repeat for you even the part that I copied from the Atlantic article in 2018 that highlights the knot we've gotten ourselves in regard to the issues of guns, which makes us then in a knot in regard to the issues of suicide, which makes it then a knot in regard to the sanctity of life. Golly, we're really not good at this. And this year has brought it to our attention. People say, I can't wait for 2020 to be over. And I say, is 2021 better? Because I can tell you, at this time last year, I did not expect this to be 2020. This has been a hellish year, and if there's anything we've learned is that we're really bad at being in charge of our lives. And when we try to go hard and to create some boundaries, we find that we cannot legislate righteousness. And that's what God the Father and God the Son drives home to us again and again. Our participation in righteousness, our part is through love. It's rooted in love. It comes back to the love of God as demonstrated when he took his people, out of bondage and liberated them, stayed with them even when they treated him badly in the wilderness. Jesus then says to us as well, love one another. It's the only instruction he gives. And we might act like a little obstinate child and be like, I don't like that answer. God looks at us and says, I know you don't, but it's the only one. Maybe we march off frustrated by such instruction. Or maybe our childish response is to say, okay, love one another, but we don't do diddly. This is hard work, loving one another. And Jesus' instructions to the Pharisees and the scribes in our New Testament lesson shows us how challenging it is to let go of our need to control the whole thing and to start from the groundwork of love and to see how love helps us create structures for the benefit of all creation. To start again at love, We discover God's provisions when we let this be our guide. And Jesus illustrates this time and again in the New Testament when he talks about prostitutes and tax collectors, people on the margin who aren't the ones who are expected to receive the goodness of God. But by Jesus' demonstration of going in amongst them, he reveals to everyone the abundant mercy and love of God in Jesus Christ. For everyone. And so we find ourselves reflecting on this very truth. Those who have taken up the invitation this year to look at racism and how to dismantle it along with white supremacy and anti-black bias, what they are discovering is the abundance of God. When they hear the spirituals that were constructed when people were denied their humanity time and again, but they remember that they're children of God. When people hear those songs and say, oh my gosh, God's mercy came to you when there was no reason. Nothing in this world that seemed to be an agent for that mercy. Wow, is God's mercy really that great? When we go among the poor and we see the joy in people's lives and we look at them and say, but you don't have what I've got. And all of a sudden we're challenged to say, wait, maybe happiness and joy isn't tied to material things. And we see the abundance and the greatness of God. Or maybe when we walk alongside of someone who's in grief or pain or who has come through a really hard time and they say, oh, the Lord has blessed me, and we know that their life has been hard. And all of a sudden we say, oh, so God's mercy and grace, is that great? You don't have to have everything put together. It doesn't have to be a sunny day, 72 degrees with a slight breeze in order for the goodness of God to be made known. This is what Jesus is illustrating to us, that the boundaries of God's love are not what we have said they are. And he refuses to settle for our desire for it to be so. And so he offers us the invitation. Do you want to follow me? That's really all it is. It's an invitation. He just asks us if we want to follow him. Amen.